Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you for having me, and thank you, folks, for joining us today. I guess I'm on the screen now. In a moment, I'm just going to pull up my slides and kind of take you through a PowerPoint presentation. So most of the focus of this presentation, as the title says, will be sort of the history and the origins of how Alcoholics Anonymous came into being, when it came into being, and then a little bit moving forward after it came into existence. But as a history teacher, I kind of wanted to combine not just that, but a little backdrop on really human consumption of alcohol. I'm going to do a whirlwind first 5 minutes, kind of world history, how far back fermented beverage goes, and then more of a focus on the United States, since AA was founded in the US. And since I teach US history, I'm going to have a little bit more information on that. So if you bear with me, the first 10, 12, maybe 15 minutes will be sort of prior to the actual birth of AA, and then the rest of the presentation will go forward from there. And I will try to leave a good 15, 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. So certainly if you've got questions, you want to put them down in chat or jot them down, that would be great. So I'm going to go ahead and hit share screen. Carolyn, do you have that there now?
I do.
All right, so that's the title of my presentation, Origins and Influences, Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'm going to get started. So I won't have too much text on these slides, but for the very beginning, before I get into the history of drinking and human consumption, some people might just be wondering, well, what is AA? I've heard a little bit about it. And I'm just going to take some excerpts from what people in the Alcoholics Anonymous Fellowship would read often at the beginning of meetings. This is AA's definition of themselves within AA. Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship of men and women who share their experience, strength, and hope with each other, that they may solve their common problem and help others to recover from alcoholism. So it's a group of men and women. Their goal is they share their experience, strength, and hope. They'll talk about what it was like, what happened, and what it's like now. And the purpose of that is to solve their common problem and help others to recover from alcoholism. Anybody can join, 10-year-olds, 110-year-olds, male, female, black, white, any religion. There's the only requirement for membership is the desire to stop drinking. So it's a very inclusive fellowship. And you don't have to pay anything for it. There's no dues or fees for AA membership. I'll talk about it at the end of the meeting. I'll talk about what AA meetings are like. But they usually will pass a hat around for rent and coffee and things like that, but there's no dues or fees. And the goal of the whole fellowship, the primary purpose is to stay sober and help other alcoholics to achieve sobriety. So those ideas are written in their AA's preamble. It kind of is their self-identification of what AA is. And it's founded in 1935 by Bill Wilson and Dr. Robert Smith. So by the end of this presentation, I'm going to catch up to those guys. So now we jump way back. As far as the first civilizations, the first recorded history of humans fermenting beverages and drinking alcohol goes back. China's probably the oldest, about 7,000 years ago. Ancient civilizations in Egypt, India, Code of Hammurabi is about 3,800 years old, and that has instructions on how to run taverns and punish people who drink excessively, etc. Certainly the Bible, Old and New Testament, is filled with references to drinking of alcohol, primarily wine. Noah, from Noah's Ark in the Genesis, was a winemaker, a vintner, I guess we would call him. Jesus' Last Supper, of course, was famous for its bread and wine. Canaan, we could go on all the stories about alcohol in the Bible. So alcohol's been around a long, long time is kind of the point of this slide. Mostly you're going to see wines and ales. We're going to see stuff what we would call 5, 6, maybe 7%, which is double proof, would be 10, 11, 12 proof beverages. So they come from fruits, berries, rice, honey. Honey mead was an old beverage, certainly grapes for wine. And in most of all these cultures, what survives as far as literature and art, it's seen as a gift. It's seen as a gift of God. Alcohol was a positive contribution to society, and only the excessive use was frowned upon. So historically, for thousands of years, mankind has been drinking alcohol, has been seeing it as a positive thing. and then really the only kind of scorn on it was for those that drank too much. So I'm going to fast forward to the Middle Ages Europe, since these are kind of the roots of the Americas. It was actually Arab nations, called nations, but Arab peoples who early in science, 1000, 1100, 1200 AD, were coming up with the earliest forms of distillation. Catholic monks from Europe who went on pilgrimages had interacted with some of these Arabs and found out, wow, they're doing some really interesting stuff with fermented beverages. So the monks actually brought it back, kind of the method on how to make stronger alcohol from the Arab world. Of course, it was supposed to be used just for primarily medicinal purposes back then. But by the 1300s, 1400s AD, Middle Ages, early Renaissance in Europe, most nations and regions were making their own alcohol distilled, in addition to what they already had, which were the ciders, the wines, the ales and beers. So we know like Scotland and Ireland by 1400 AD were making whiskey. England had a huge gin explosion in the 1700s. They had had ale for centuries. Spanish and French were known for bringing wines over to the Americas. Germany, Netherlands, beer. Colonial America. So now, 1607, we all know from where we're from, Virginia, when the first permanent settlements on the East Coast came, started our 13 colonies, was Jamestown. 1620 would have been the Pilgrims on the Mayflower. And both of those societies came over with almost a mandate to immediately plant orchards, vineyards, hops, fields of hops, barley, rye. They were very much concerned with having alcoholic beverages when they arrived. And part of that reason was coming from England. The towns and cities they may have come from, their drinking water was sketchy at best. People were getting sick from it. There was contaminated water. They didn't know about necessarily where to have, latrines versus their drinking water sources. And so alcoholic beverages were actually preferred as a safer drinking option. I know it sounds pretty weird, but 15, 16, 1700s, that was known. So cider in the Americas, in the 13 colonies, certainly ale and beer. There was a thing called ship's beer, ship's ale, which was about 3%, which children would have. It was served at all meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Colonists were drinking. It was not seen as an intoxicant. They were not drinking for the purpose of getting drunk so much as it was less expensive than tea or coffee, which you'd also boil water for. Didn't spoil like milk. It certainly wasn't contaminated like drinking water. So we're going to see, as far as the first peoples coming to post 1600, 1607, a very accepted view of alcohol in their society. These are just a couple pictures. You got your red coats here at a tavern. Looks like drinking out of a nice pan full of ale, most likely. Taverns, of course, were very central to social life. The earliest courthouses were in taverns. Most all business deals were conducted in taverns. Certainly religious, celebrations. So alcohol was very much a part of colonial life. That takes us until about the late 1600s, and some of you might remember this from your middle school years or high school, the triangle trade, if you remember 3 legs. There's obviously more going on here than just 3 simple legs, but you'd see Africans, slaves being shipped from Africa to the Americas. You would see raw materials being shipped from the Americas to England, and then you would see manufactured goods being shipped out of Europe, primarily England. Those going to Africa, guns, cloth, iron, beer. What I wanted to point out was on almost all of these, you'll see rum or sugar or molasses, and you'll see it going both ways. There's rum's going to be 40 to 50%. That's 80 to 80, 90, maybe 100 proof. So for the first time, we're going to see, I'm just going to focus on the Americas, a beverage that's 6, 7, 8 times stronger than what they were used to drinking. We do know there was excessive drinking in ancient China, India, Egypt, etc. My focus today is more on the Americas and what happens there. I think you can't overlook the introduction of hard liquor to what's going to happen with the drinking patterns in the Americas, especially North America and the 13 colonies. By the late 1700s, those Scots and Irish who have been making whiskey for a couple centuries were bringing their stills and methods to the colonies. And so in addition to rum, you're going to see different types of whiskeys being introduced: corn, grain, rye, etc. And that's a big, quick change from 5 or 6% alcohol to 40, 50%. A couple fun facts: the last full year of George Washington's life after he left being a general and a president, his Mount Vernon farm produced more alcohol than any other place in the 13 colonies. He was the Jim Beam, Jack Daniels of the United States at that point. He dies at the end of 1799. He had a Scottish farm manager who convinced him to change all the rye fields he had been growing, not for bread grain, but for some other purpose. And he made unaged rye whiskey that was getting bought up. 11,000 gallons is one full year. 1807, you're going to see 40 commercial distilleries in Boston compared to 2 breweries. So those are just letting you know, if you went to Mount Vernon today, the center one is what was being sold, the clear, unaged. It's before they started burning casks. That's where the amber color comes from. But you can still buy rye whiskey from Mount Vernon if you're interested. So by the Revolutionary War period, you guys remember from your history classes, we have 1776, Declaration of Independence, late 1770s, early 1780s, we're still fighting this Revolutionary War. By 1787, as the Constitution gets written, if you look at this chart, this is per capita, per person in the 13 colonies. Annual consumption of distilled spirits, not the cider and the ale, but rum, whiskey, gin, etc., climbs a little bit till about the Revolutionary War, dips a little, and then from about the 1790s to the 1830s, it doubles. And that's when all this whiskey from Scott, Ireland contributions, rum, we've won the Revolutionary War, we've got our own country, massive consuming of hard liquor. And by the mid-1800s, intoxication is seen as a growing social problem. You've got families that are getting ripped apart. Usually it's the males who are the breadwinners. They're losing their work. They're paying all, wages are going into the taverns, violence at home, disruption. And so increases in crime, poverty, broken families. This is a new country. And people are going, is this the kind of country we want to be? A lot of, there's drunks in the streets. The temperance movement picks up steam in the 1830s and 1840s, and then you see this sharp decline during those decades. And the temperance kind of meant to temper your drinking, didn't mean necessarily abstain. It meant to decrease it, to temper it. So I'm going to see if I can zoom in. I don't know if I can. Oh, let me go back. I'm not sure I can expand, but this cartoon on the left, this comes from both the one on the far left and far right are 1830s, 1840s. 2 children at the door of the tavern. Here's dad, the fathers are in there throwing them down. The bartender's skull and crossbones, violence in the background. This actually kind of shows the process of alcoholism. This was an 1840s cartoon called The Drunkard's Progress. Here's the widower and their child. The house is on fire. Drinking starts convivial, social. Now the person's deep in their cups, losing friends, losing jobs, losing their life. So the temperance movement, and this woman is called Carrie Nation in the middle. She would have been progressive era, 1890s, turn of the century. Bible in one hand, hatchet in the other. Her nickname was Carrie Hatchet. She would actually go into bars and saloons and bust up bar stools, kegs, to try to represent the temperance. Anti-Saloon League and the WCTU were 2 of the largest temperance organizations, but there were dozens and dozens of them throughout the 1800s. Eventually the push was for prohibition. I'll get to that in a moment. So during all this time frame, what's happening to people that suffer from alcoholism? In 1849, a Swedish physician named Huss, H-U-S-S, Magnus Huss, was the first to coin the term. It was Latin, it was alcoholismus chronicus, it was chronic alcoholism. So the term alcoholism had been around since the mid-1800s, but people who suffered from it were often locked up in asylums. This picture here is one of the earliest ones, the Inebriate Asylum in Binghamton, New York, from the 1840s, 1850s. I believe it still stands there. Prisons, doctors tried bloodletting, mercury treatments, etc. But they couldn't figure out how to help these people address their drinking. either physically lock them up, chain them down, put them in a cell, remove them from alcohol, or try these other methods that weren't working. Often seen as either a moral issue, these people are sinners, it's a demon realm, work of the devil, or they just had lack of willpower, they're weak. Um, and so some of the shaming that was going on, lowlifes, degenerates, what's wrong with these people? Most other people can drink some and stop, and these people can't. Throughout the 1800s, there was various leagues and clubs where people themselves would join to try to address their own drinking. The Washingtonians was a famous one in the 1840s. At one point, just prior to 1850, I think they had over 600,000 members in it, but it did not continue by the 1850s. Before the Civil War, the Washingtonians dispersed. Eventually moved into the field of politics, and you have dries versus wets. So a political platform, a dry would say we maybe would look at prohibition. Maybe we should stop allowing alcohol in this country. It's destructive. Whereas wet said, Bill of Rights, freedoms, liberties, this country is founded, you're not going to take away my alcohol. By 1919, the 18th Amendment gets passed. It ratified by 1920, and for 13 years, from 1920 to 1933, in this country, the United States, it was illegal to transport, manufacture, or sell alcohol. Those three. You weren't allowed to transport it, manufacture it, or sell it. If you just said, well, I'm holding a bottle, I'm drinking a cup of beer, that's not transporting, manufacturing, or selling it. So technically that was legal. But by and large, we think of during Prohibition, and this picture's from that era, that it was illegal to have alcohol. So you see speakeasies and rum runners and bootlegging and the Roaring Twenties, Al Capone, etc. You're going to find that 18th Amendment started in 1920. It was not very effective. I'll go back a little bit. It was not effective, and as I said, crime was still going on, this black market, and by the time FDR becomes president, inaugurated in 1933, that's when they ended Prohibition. They found it wasn't working, and it wasn't great for the Great Depression either, for that matter. So all these different attempts have been tried for thousands of years. We still have alcoholism in this country. What do we do now? And that take us to 1933, Roosevelt's president. 1934, we're still in the Great Depression. I want to introduce you to William Griffith Wilson. He's going to be known as Bill. I don't have check my time here. Okay, 3:20, very good. So Bill Wilson, and you're just going to hear me referring to him as Bill for the rest of this presentation. That's why if you see bumper stickers, friend of Bill, that's who they're referring to, is probably people in Alcoholics Anonymous. Essentially is the founder or co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. He was a Vermont native, served in World War I, came back during the Roaring Twenties, lived in Brooklyn with his wife, Lois, who, by the way, was co-founder of Al-Anon. We'll talk about her later on. By the early 1930s, he was very much in his cups. His own alcoholism was spiraling out of control. His previous successes as a stockbroker, he was getting fired and let go of. He was having a hard time just maintaining a job. In 1934, he went to this hospital called Towns Hospital in New York City, 4 separate occasions. So he was relapsing. They'd dry him out. He'd go back, try to get work. He would return to drinking. He would end up in a bad way. He would get checked into Towns Hospital again. It was known for treating alcoholics, and the facility was run by Dr. William Silkworth. I'm going to talk a little bit about him later as well. Silkworth introduces Bill to this disease concept of alcoholism, which very few people have been talking about. Benjamin Rush in the 1790s, turn of the century, 1800s, signed the Declaration of Independence. He was one of the first American physicians to mention something about disease, something in the mind. He was giving gold treatments. He didn't exactly have a treatment for it, but he kind of had some sort of inkling that there was a disease aspect to alcoholism. Silkworth in the 1930s treated over 40,000 alcoholics at Towns Hospital in his lifetime. So he had seen a lot of it. He likened alcoholism to an allergy, and he believed that the only way alcoholics could survive was just to abstain. They could not do controlled drinking. So he was a little bit ahead of his time on that. Nobody else had sort of figured this out. Between the 3rd and 4th visit, Bill Wilson attends these Oxford group meetings. I'm going to come back to the Oxfords in a minute. This is a little flyer from the day, Towns Hospital, Central Park West in New York, alcoholism drug. They would give Bill and others castor oil and belladonna. And I guess castor oil was to kind of help purge and clean out. Belladonna, I think, is also a toxin. It was nicknamed the purge and puke treatment. So it basically was a detox, but they had no aftercare. They had no treatment plan. They had no way of all these, thousands of alcoholics checking into this hospital. They would dry out. Dr. Silkworth might pat him on the back and others say, good luck. And you might see him again a month, 3 months, 5 months later. They didn't have a way of keeping them away from the next drink. They could dry them out and help them. This quote from the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, there's a passage called The Doctor's Opinion, which was written by Dr. Silkworth. That's his picture here. The action of alcohol on these chronic alcoholics is a manifestation of an allergy. These allergic types can never safely use alcohol in any form at all. So this is his opinion, and he's going to teach Bill Wilson this concept. And this concept will very much be part of the backbone of Alcoholics Anonymous, at least along the medical lines. So Bill Wilson had a lifelong friend, a Vermont buddy named Ebbie Thatcher that he grew up with, who also moved to New York. Ebbie Thatcher also was a heavy drinker, an alcoholic. And during Bill's fourth visit, December of 1934, in that hospital, Ebbie Thatcher, who had been going to these Oxford group meetings, and I will talk about the Oxford group in a minute, probably my next slide. Ebbie Thatcher was not drinking now, and he was able to not drink on his own. And he wanted to carry the message of what he had learned in the Oxford group to Bill Wilson. And Bill had been told by Dr. Silkworth that he was starting to suffer brain damage, that Dr. Silkworth had no plan for him. He basically said, Bill, I think you're going to die if you can't stop drinking. It's a one-way ticket. And in desperation, Bill Wilson, after one of these Ebbie Thatcher visits, shouts out, and he writes about this in the big book of AA, if there be a God, let him show himself. And Bill Wilson writes that the room filled with light, this is after Ebbie had left the hospital bedroom, a great peace stole over me. I became acutely conscious of a presence which seemed like a veritable sea of spirit. This is December of 1934. Bill Wilson has been struggling with relapsing nonstop for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. At the age of 39, he would not have another drink the rest of his life. So something happened in that hospital experience with either combination of Dr. Silkworth's information, Oxford group teachings that he was starting to tinker with, Ebbie Thatcher telling him about the power of a higher power, and really hitting a bottom and shouting out, if there be a God, let him show himself. So Bill gets checked out of the hospital in December 34. He moves home to be with Lois. Ebbie, his friend, moves in with the Wilsons. They continue to attend Oxford meeting groups together. Bill is concerned about this God stuff, and Ebbie explains it's more spiritual than religious. Real quickly, this Oxford group was a non-denominational support group. It started decades before the 1930s. It was not about alcohol at all. It was about self-improvement. It had a lot of Christian concepts in it, but the focus was on honesty, unselfish love, and purity. I think I have one piece of information here. The core belief was that human suffering stems from fear and selfishness. And to overcome life's problems, one must overcome fear and selfishness. Restitution, which is like making amends to those you hurt, using prayer and meditation, getting right with God. Those were the kind of concepts that were already in the Oxford group that are going to kind of spill out and get absorbed into Alcoholics Anonymous. So I can't talk about the formation of AA without talking about the Oxford group, without talking about Dr. Silkworth. Ebbie would be somebody that Bill Wilson considered his first sponsor. It's a terminology they use in AA. Oxford group meetings were held in private homes, in churches, lots of fellowship and friendship. People would kind of testify in front of each other about their sins and get support and help from one another. The Oxford group literature defines the group as not being a religion. It had no hierarchy, no temples, no endowments, so there was no dues or fees, just like AA. Its workers had no salaries, no plans but God's plan. And the goal was to lead a spiritual life and carry the message. And this is also very much embedded into AA's principles. When Bill Wilson kept arguing with Ebby about this God stuff, Ebby said, I want you to read this book written by William James. I think the book was published around 1906. Harvard professor. The book's called Varieties of Religious Experience. It's also referred to in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. James was considered the father of American psychology, and he wrote a series of case studies about individual men and women who had had some kind of spiritual conversion. And the three commonalities that all these different case studies have: one, the individual had some kind of calamity, some kind of tragedy, desperation. Two, they each admitted defeat. And the third one was that they appealed to some kind of higher power, and it was not necessarily God. So a fairly natural overlap between Oxford group ideas and what William James was talking about. And Ebby, again, would be passing this on to Bill Wilson. So now we have three different puzzle pieces that are starting to come together for this one individual, Bill Wilson. That there's a physical aspect, a mental aspect, and a spiritual aspect of this disease. Silkworth taught him about the allergy, the compulsion, that you have to have total abstinence, but abstinence alone was not enough. 40,000 men and women got checked out of that hospital. Most of them did not stay sober. Just getting dry was not a treatment. That there was a mental obsession, no mental defense against the first drink. When they write the 12 steps, there's a reference to sanity and insanity in the second step. The knowledge of having this disease is not enough to keep somebody sober. So there's this third component, the spiritual. One of the early members that was a friend of Ebby's in the Oxford group, who also was looking at trying to stop drinking, went and visited Dr. Jung in Switzerland. Dr. Carl Jung, pretty famous psychiatrist, told him, you need a complete psychic change, that you're of the kind of alcoholics that can't and won't get sober unless you have like a complete transformation. And so all three of these need to come together. And Bill Wilson, who's newly sober now, is going to try to continue his sobriety. Ebby, by the way, does not stay sober. He stays sober for bits and pieces of the rest of his life, but he is not a continued sober person like Bill Wilson. Bill puts together a couple months. He goes back and visits, goes to Oxford group meetings. He visits the town's hospital to try to work with alcoholics because he had heard about that kind of component in the Oxford group of trying to help others. Ebby's been working with him. And by the spring of 1935, a business partner says, we're trying to get you back on your feet again in the business world. Come with us to Akron, National Rubber Company. We've got a business deal. And so Bill is at the Mayflower Hotel, and this is like really where the birth of AA happens. And his New York friends had gone back to New York. So he's at the hotel by himself. Saturday afternoon, he can hear the people at the bar down the hallway, glasses clinking, people giggling, the piano, the music. And he's like, well, maybe I could just have one. And the alcoholic, that mental obsession, his disease starts talking to him. And he's like, I need a drunk to work with. He goes to the directory, looks up phone numbers, gets one name, puts him in touch with another set of names, puts him in touch with this gentleman named Dr. Robert Smith. In AA, they call him Dr. Bob. So there's Bill and Dr. Bob, and those are the co-founders. You see the pictures there on the left. This is Bill Wilson here, Dr. Bob with the glasses. And on Mother's Day, I believe it was, May 12th of 1935, Bill Wilson talks to Ann Smith, which is Dr. Bob's wife, and she's like, I'll get you to meet with him, but Dr. Bob told his wife, I'll meet with this guy for 15 minutes. They go to the gatehouse of the guy who was co-founder of Goodyear Rubber Company, and they use the gatehouse there, and they meet. 6 hours later, Dr. Bob leaves this 15-minute discussion, tells his wife, this guy's onto something. He can read me like a book. He knows what I've got. Bill stays in Akron. He moves in with the Wilsons, and the two of them stay up late at nights with coffee pots and start designing a talk. How are we going to help other people? This idea of I need a drunk to work with is really the core of Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill Wilson found out I couldn't get anybody sober and he told his wife this, Lois, when I was working with those people at the town's hospital, Lois, I don't think anybody's getting sober. And she turns to him early on and says, Bill, you're sober. This is the longest I've seen you sober since I can remember. And that's why when he was in Akron and he felt like maybe I want to go down to the lounge and have a couple drinks, I need a drunk to work with. So Dr. Bob was the first one he meets. Dr. Bob gets a couple weeks sobriety, goes to a medical conference, has one last relapse. And then on June 10th, 1935, before Dr. Bob has a surgical procedure to conduct, and he's heavily hungover, Bill Wilson buys him a beer before pre-op, and that's Dr. Bob's last drink. It's AA considers the birthday of AA is June 10th, 1935, considered AA's birthday. The third person to get sober, so Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob, they found a guy in Akron that was looking for help, and they visit him, and this guy named Bill D gets sober on June 26, 1935. This is just an artist's rendition. In AA, they'd call this a 12-step call. These two guys trying to help somebody who's getting sober. And Bill D was able to maintain sobriety for the rest of his life. So it's very slow going. There's a pocket of people in Akron, Ohio, because that's where Dr. Bob is, and he starts helping people get sober. Bill Wilson goes back to New York with Eddie, some Oxford group people, and they get a little pocket of sober people in AA. But 2 years later, there's about 40 recovering people in the United States. It's not huge growth. And Bill and Bob decide they need to spread the word faster. They need to put all these ideas of the program, we might call it, into a book. And so Bill Wilson and others write this book entitled Alcoholics Anonymous. It gets published January of 1939. It has the 12 steps of recovery in it. What AA people would say, it's the program is in there. It's got a whole host of stories in the back of the book. The first 164 pages, I believe, is the basic text. They had a second edition in the 1950s, a third edition, 1976, another edition, fourth edition, I think it was 2001. And the same program of AA, the same 164 pages that Bill Wilson and others wrote is the beginning of those editions, but they put different stories in the back. Within a couple of years, it was several thousand members. It spread to Chicago, Cleveland, some other cities. And then in 1941, you'd have to be older than I am, but there was a pretty famous magazine, the Saturday Evening Post. And there was an article written in it about alcoholics. Again, I don't think I can enlarge my screen, but you can see here, the drunkard's best friend. A guy named Jack Alexander wrote a full-length article on this new program where thousands of these men and women, mostly men, but there were women getting sober in the 30s, early 40s. Something was happening, and the word spread. It tripled in 1 year, from 2,000 to 6,000. By 1950, there was over 90,000 members of AA. These are fairly accurate numbers. They have a central office, a general service organization, and it just kept growing exponentially. By 1975, 500,000. By the early 80s, they break 1 million. By 2000, there's over 2 million. Kind of levels off. I would say now that there's like 2.2, 2.4 million people in AA. There was about 500 groups at the end of World War II. Today, there's over 125,000 groups. All 50 states, over 180 nations have Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. As well, there's over 25 different 12-step groups, anonymous 12-step groups that sprung off the original AA. Cocaine Anonymous, Debtors Anonymous, Gamblers, Narcotics, Overeaters Anonymous are some of the more famous ones. So what started with this stockbroker with 3 or 4 months of tentative sobriety meeting an Akron surgeon who was a secret closet drinker who, literally had to take sedatives and drink alcohol before he would do surgery. These two guys started a program that now 180 plus countries, 25 plus other groups, millions of people have benefited from the program. So what exactly is an AA meeting? What might be a question people would have, because that's kind of where it comes together for a lot of people. AA members meet in groups, kind of like Oxford group. They could be in churches, they could be in schools, community centers, probably not so much at people's houses, but you can have them there. Any place that tends to rent out space can host an AA meeting. Open meetings would be anybody who wants to. You don't have to identify as an alcoholic. If you were, doctor, nurse, or just a curious person, or somebody who's got alcoholism and you want to learn about what's going on in AA, you can go to open meetings. Closed meetings would be for people who identify as being alcoholic. Speaker meeting, usually the meetings are 1 hour long. speaker meeting might have somebody talking for 20, 30, 40 minutes. There's some that they'll speak almost a full hour, some just 10 or 15, then they open it up for discussion. Discussion meetings might look more like this room on the left, where they might kick out a topic and then anybody and everybody can share. A big book meeting would mean they're reading from a passage from that text that I showed you. They call it the big book. Of course, the title of it is Alcoholics Anonymous. I can't remember if I told you, Cleveland was responsible. The Cleveland people in AA named their group after the big book in 1939. There was a Cleveland group called Alcoholics Anonymous, and that started spreading. That's why they started calling the groups named after the book. A step meeting would just be, all right, they're going to work on the third step today, fifth step, whatever. And that would be the topic of conversation. There are no dues or fees, as I mentioned at the beginning, so it's by donations. There's a thing called the 12 Traditions, which kind of guides the meetings. They have no leaders but trusted servants. But you need to raise money. Just, often they'll have coffee or snacks, literature. New people who come to AA that might be seeking sobriety are encouraged to get a sponsor, somebody who's got some sobriety that can help walk them through the steps. It's suggested they get into some kind of service, helping others. It could be setting up chairs before a meeting, going to a detox meeting. And anonymity is really, they call this foundation, the spiritual foundation of it. So that's why you saw Bill D or Dr. Bob. Technically, most people know Bill Wilson. They might just call him Bill. But so let me, Carolyn, if you want to help me, I wanted to have about 20 minutes at the end. I think I'm right about on schedule if I look at the clock. I've got slides that would show what the 12 steps, 12 traditions are. But I just want to check if people have any questions, comments. I guess I would stop share, right? Okay.
Yes, and I'll stop your spotlight. So.
Okay. I don't know if I should look at chat, if anybody's put anything, if anybody's got a.
I have a question.
Sure.
That was sort of interesting material. Carl Jung, I'm somewhat familiar with him, but I don't know how he, could you say again how he relates to the William James and the Big Book?
Absolutely. Well, I'll start with, there was a gentleman, R-O-W-L-A-N-D, Rowland, I'm not sure if you pronounce it Roland or Rowland H. He keeps his anonymity, and he was from a Rhode Island family, had means, kind of like Ebby or Bill. They had money, but they kept just drinking, and the life was getting destructive. He actually used some of his money to fly to Europe and try to get the best care he could get. And he was a patient of Dr. Carl Jung's in the early 1930s. He lived in Switzerland for several months. Was physically sober, was seeing Dr. Carl Jung frequently, felt like he had gotten better, flew back to the United States, and within a short period of time relapsed. He flew back to Switzerland, met with Dr. Jung, said, "What is wrong with me? You were the best doctor I can find." We did months and months of treatment. And Dr. Jung, and this is also written in the Big Book, tells him, alcoholics of your variety, meaning you are, sometimes they'll use the phrase hopeless. Some of these doctors will be like, I've done all the tricks I know. You need to have a psychic change. Dr. Carl Jung, if you're familiar with his work, very much the spiritual life of somebody was very central to his work. And he felt that alcoholics can't just put the plug in the jug and say, I'll swear it off, or I'll read books and go, gee, I think I understand the nature of my illness, or even meet with Dr. Jung and work on my emotions or my understanding that something bigger and deeper, maybe a power greater than yourself, has to assist you in this recovery. And so Jung told him, you need to have like a spiritual transformation. And that Jung also said, I have met people that have had this happen and they no longer drink. And Dr. Jung, this is before the 12 steps even existed. So he told this guy, Roland H., you're almost a hopeless case unless you can have this psychic change, unless you can have a transformational experience. It doesn't mean go back to your mass or go back to your church and that wasn't working for a lot of these individuals. It's like, hey, I believe in God, I read the Bible, I go to service, but I can't stop drinking. And so Jung kind of put that idea in him, and he went back to his Oxford group meetings, Roland H. And he knew Ebby, and so they kind of compared notes. And when the Big Book of AA was getting written, they put Roland H's story in there as sort of, and they do mention Dr. Jung by name in the Big Book. But yeah, it's kind of, and so the connection with William James would be, people have spiritual, you can call them conversions, transformations. In AA, they call it a spiritual experience. Initially, they were going to call it a spiritual awakening, and the early AA guys told Dr. Bill Wilson, that seems a little too extreme, or it might be the other way around. I think it was spiritual experience, and they changed it to a spiritual awakening. I could look at the 12th step and find out, but it didn't mean it. So there's a lot of people that were atheists and agnostics that were trying to get sober, and Bill Wilson himself scoffed at God. And yet, in the 12 steps, there is a very central spiritual, they use the term God as you understand them, higher power. Some people that were kind of helping him write the steps said, you can't leave the God part out, but you also can't just make it sound like it's church. So he had to strike this balance of, just like I showed that one slide, it's a threefold illness, and they write about that in AA, that you need to heal physically, mentally, and spiritually. And if you're only doing one or two of those, you're liable to relapse.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? I do have, if people want to see what those steps look like, what's in those steps, I could show that. Let me go ahead. I'm going to go back to. So it starts with we. And so, it's kind of past tense. So when Bill Wilson and those early AA people, and there were only, a couple hundred when he was writing these, this is kind of the program. Like, we took these 12 steps. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol. Those 25 plus other groups might be, we admitted we were powerless over cocaine. We admitted we were powerless over gambling. Whatever the issue is, they kind of use these 12 steps as a template and put in whatever the issue is. But the original ones were alcohol. Our lives have become unmanageable. Right off the bat, okay, now that you admit you're powerless, yikes, there's going to be some people that go, I don't like this God stuff. Bill Wilson was one of them. So they use the term power greater than ourselves. And for some people in AA, it's the group. It's those, 20 other men and women sitting in the room that all figured it out and got sober. Wow, I couldn't do that on my own, but they could. Maybe they've got more power than I can. Eventually, it might be, something somebody prays to, whatever their definition is. But the terminology is just power greater than ourselves. People asked Bill Wilson, what did you mean by sanity here? And he said, it's not the crazy thing people do when they're drunk. Non-alcoholics do crazy stuff. They'll swing off the chandeliers and stuff. It's when someone like Bill Wilson or Dr. Bob, somebody who's got that chronic alcoholism, who keeps destroying their lives when they drink, gets physically sober. They might get a couple weeks, couple months. Oh, my life's good now. I guess I can drink now. And they think it's okay. It'll be different this time. That's what Bill Wilson meant by the sanity. And of course, Dr. Silkworth saw it 40,000 times over. That there is kind of you think it's going to be different this time based on what? No, the person ends up, in the gutter again. So believing that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Not sure what that's going to look like. Keep working the steps. Turn your will and life over to the care of God, and they put this in italics and purpose, as we understood him. So it's not the Catholic God, it's not the Presbyterian, Baptist, Jewish, Hindu, none of that. It's as you, the person sitting in the AA meeting, as you understand God. All the rest of these largely come borrowed from the Oxford group, taking an inventory of yourself and admitting it. It's kind of like confession. As getting ready to have God remove defects of character and ask him, helping to remove those. Those are my flaws, those are my sins, whatever. They use the term defects of character in AA. Did you hurt people? Do you need to make restitution, Oxford group would say? Then you need to make a list of those persons you had harmed and then go make amends to those people. Now that you get sober, you might still be a jerk once in a while. Maybe you're harming people. You need to continue to take personal inventory, and when wrong, promptly admit it. So it's like keep your side of the street clear. Oxford group was big on prayer and meditation. Improve your conscious contact with God as you understand Him, praying only for knowledge of His will, the power to carry that out. And then lastly, that carry the message part the Oxford group had. Bill Wilson found out 1934, 35, if I can't carry this message and try to help somebody else out, I'm liable to drink again. And so, here's the term awakening, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. So I've likened it to like a obstacle course. Somebody who's going to be in the Army or the Marines or whatever, they have to run through tires and over walls and ropes and climb. They have to do all the stuff to get strong, get ready for battle. Members of AA might do all these steps so that they can get to having had a spiritual awakening. That they will have sort of cleaned house. They talked about the term cleaning house in AA. So it's not just, okay, I drank too much, I need to stop, and I feel all this ick from my previous years of alcoholism. It's like, no, you need to clean house, and that's what these steps help them do, and to get a relationship of the higher power of their understanding. There is a chapter in the big book of AA called To the Agnostics. So they recognize, and as I recall, it says something about nearly half of our fellowship they don't like the God thing. And, alcoholics often go through rough stuff. It's like, well, I don't like this God. How could there be a God if my life is like this? And so they try to help them manage these 12 steps, even if they are atheists or agnostics. So it's an interesting walk. So the 12 traditions were created, I think they were first published in the 1946 or 49, it's in the late 40s. And this, like the 12 steps are for the individual alcoholic. The 12 traditions are to try to help keep the fellowship of AA from imploding. Like I told you, dozens and dozens of groups got started in the 1800s, self-help groups to try to help people stop drinking. None of them lasted very long. The Washingtonians being the largest, with over 500,000 people. But there'd be infighting, there'd be issues that went from inside out, and the groups were not able to stay. And these just have a lot of wisdom. If I was going to start a company or a business, if I was CEO of a large corporation, I would probably go to these traditions and borrow some. I think there's a lot of wisdom. The first things first is a slogan they use in AA, but personal recovery depends upon AA unity. We can't be fighting. AA members, AA groups can't fight with each other because their goal is to help other people get sober. There are no leaders, so there's no CEO or president or whatever. It's just trusted servants. So different people will rotate who runs a meeting, that kind of thing. Each group's autonomous. Just because one group likes to do a speaker meeting doesn't mean all of them have to do speaker meetings. They can choose what they want to do. Primary purpose, to carry this message to the alcoholic who still suffers. Very clear statements. They don't get into endorsing or financing groups. They don't want to be affiliated with other outside groups. There's no politics, no religions. AA wants to keep clear of all of this because they know that outside issues can erode the actual fellowship. And so it's 85 years old now. It's gone from 2 people to 2 million. And I would say a lot of the wisdom of what's in these 12 traditions has helped that happen. Forever non-professional. So you don't have people getting, there are some people that work like secretaries and things like that. They can employ special workers, but by and large, there's not, they decline outside contributions. I almost had this as a slide, but John D. Rockefeller was contacted back in I think it was late 30s, early 40s. I think it was before they had the first book, so it would have been late 30s, for a donation. And he was the one that gave them and said, if I give you the kind of donation you're looking for, Bill Wilson and you early timers, it's going to wreck your fellowship. He wrote a check for like $5,000. He could have written a check for, hundreds of times that. But he felt like you guys need to be self-supporting. And John D. Rockefeller helped AA by telling him, you need to be self-supporting. Otherwise, this fellowship, this organization you're doing will not last. And so they have that written into the 12 traditions that we have to be self-supporting. No opinion on outside issues, shouldn't be drawn in public controversy. And the anonymity I was talking about on one of those last slides, the spiritual foundation of all our traditions, place principles above personality. So if you go to an AA meeting and somebody's driving you nuts there, it's like, you know what? It's not about the personalities. It's about the program. It's about the common, common welfare, the common goal, the common purpose. And so AA puts this down in their traditions. And I would say that's what's kept them. I'm not saying every business would work on this model by any means, but I do think there's some wisdom in it. Because if you think about who's in AA, this is a bunch of alcoholics starting an organization, and somehow they pull off that, 180 plus countries. And it's definitely, and they also talk about, Bill Wilson was real clear, AA does not corner the market on treatment of alcohol. This is just one option. It's one program. Bill Wilson talks about people going back to their faith. If you have a priest, a rabbi, somebody that works for you, that please use that. So if you like to see a counselor or a therapist, Bill Wilson himself suffered from depression in his sobriety. His last 10, 20 years, he saw counselors, he saw all kinds of treatment. So they're very inclusive, I think, of seeking outside help, whether that be religious, medical, psychiatric. And they own, we don't know everything. They kind of write that in their literature. We only know, we don't know all the answers, kind of thing. So there's a humility that the program has. Other questions or thoughts? I see a chat. There's a couple numbers on the chat. Let me go here. That's a couple thank yous. Let me see if I had a slide. I thought I had a slide on Lois. Let me go back. I can't skip Lois here. My gosh. You think about families. This woman went through heck.
Sorry.
I won't use the full language. This is Lois Wilson. She co-founds Al-Anon, Ann B. and Lois Wilson. So she's stuck by her husband, Bill Wilson, for many, many, many years, many relapses, many dark episodes. And by the early 50s, she's finding, gosh, there's not just wives, but there's all kinds of people, family members, who suffer when their loved one is an alcoholic. And so Al-Anon takes the Al from alcoholics and Anon from anonymous. And they it's a 12-step group using the same 12 steps. They only change the word alcoholics to others. So in the 12th step, we try to carry this message to others instead of to alcoholics. And then another thing sprang off of Al-Anon is called Alateen, which would be for children and teenagers of alcoholics, 1957. So there's a lot of help that is available for friends and loved ones of people who struggle with alcoholism in those two programs, Al-Anon and Alateen. I'd like to, Carolyn, do you know if I can zoom in on how to zoom in on a slide, or can you do that?
So at the bottom of your screen on the right, there's a minus and a plus sign.
Okay.
Try that.
Let's see if this guy will stay focused. This is interesting. I'm pretty sure this one was in 1840. The drunkard progress from the first glass to the grave. And I'm sorry, it's a little graphic there at the end. But it says a glass with friend, a glass to keep the cold out, a glass too much. So now, drunk and riotous. So now we're getting a little cantankerous. The summit attained, jolly companions. It's a confirmed drunkard. So, Dr. Silkworth and people in the medical model would say this cartoon's way ahead of its time because alcoholism is progressive. Somebody starts the first time they drink in their teens, 20s, whatever. It usually is jovial, fun, exciting. Maybe they had a couple of little scenarios, things happen, ooh, I got in trouble. But if somebody has alcoholism, their physical body doesn't react to alcohol the way people who don't have it. And they might continue down the second half despite the consequences, despite, maybe I lost my job, I've lost my third job, maybe I'm getting divorced, my kids hate me, poverty, disease, forsaken by friends. And sadly, alcoholism somebody who's not treated will take it down. And thought I had a slide on the disease too. Let me see if I had that at the end. I guess I didn't. Maybe that was 17. Yeah, I'll just mention, I know we're almost out of time. 1956, the American Medical Association declared that alcoholism was a disease. It's the first time we've done that in this country. And they qualify it by a number of criteria. If you're in the AMA, I'm just going to read 4 of them. That the illness is primary, meaning it did not arise from some other condition. Alcoholism is itself, exists in and of itself. It's chronic, which means it does not go away. It will not heal spontaneously or remit. That it's progressive. It's another criteria for disease, that over time it will get worse, like that cartoon was showing. Symptomatic, diseases need to be symptomatic. AMA would say that alcoholism can be diagnosed by the way it manifests in a person's physiology, behavior, and lifestyle. And lastly, fatal, sadly. If left untreated, can and will result in death. So there's, what's that?
Sorry, Tolly, we have one question. So just whenever you wrap that up, there's a question.
So according to those, and of course, insurance companies for the last 60 plus years would love for the AMA to get rid of that decision, because they've had to fork up a lot of money for treatment centers. But the AMA is stuck by their guns. 64 years later, they go, no, it's a disease. Go ahead, question.
Could you explain what a blackout is?
Blackout, when someone consumes enough alcohol that it's essentially like amnesia. So you're at a party and somebody's talking to you, it's midnight for 2 hours in the kitchen till 2 in the morning. They seem like they're in their cups. You're not so much. They call you up the next day to talk about the party, and they go, hey, or you ask them about your conversation, and they go, I was talking with you? You're like, yes, for 2 hours in the kitchen. You don't remember? No. Or they drove home and they don't remember it at all. So blackout's not the same as passing out when somebody drinks so much they just crash in a couch or a chair. But when they're functioning, they're walking, they're talking, they're driving under the influence, but the next day, future time, they cannot recall that. That's what the blackout is. And doctors would say it's very similar to, it essentially is a form of amnesia. That there is no recollection. Couldn't remember driving home. Couldn't remember talking to my friend in the kitchen. Yes, Chris.
I wonder if you're aware or of any the relationship between developmental trauma or various kinds of trauma and addiction, and I think there's some new movements or new I think it's fairly new in the field in terms of understanding how trauma or early trauma or could be, shock trauma might be a contributing factor or the key factor to addiction or to alcoholism. So I just...
No, that's a great question. I will own that I don't have a whole lot of background in that specifically. I do know a number of people who have, some of them war veterans, who deal with, whether it be PTSD. I also know some people who have had childhood traumas, wasn't war, but it was, sexual or physical traumas that have gotten sober in recovery, some that I've worked with. It makes it very difficult. There's just a whole set of other issues they're dealing with. I think as far as the onset of alcoholism, for someone, alcohol and or other drugs can sort of help alleviate the angst, the pain, the, years later from going through traumatic experiences. I've been more on the treatment end as a substance abuse counselor. I think where past trauma can often interrupt somebody's recovery. I think it does both. I think it can lead them towards, gosh, when I drink, I feel better. When I use these substances, I don't have to feel the pain or the trauma that resides in me from past experiences. But then in recovery, they might go, wow, I drank to the point of I need to stop. And then they're still left with, how am I going to deal with these feelings? And so that's where I would strongly, I'd say recommendation, but that's where, and Bill Wilson would agree, and he's been deceased for 50 years, but that's where outside help, I think, is really important. That there are treatment modalities that are available for people in recovery to deal with that. I've heard that there are 12-step groups, like it said in the traditions, autonomous. I'm a little leery of this, of people saying we're going to have an AA group that deals with trauma, because AA is not really licensed to do that. That's why I would say outside help is, it's like somebody who's bulimic in AA. You don't touch that with a 10-foot pole in an AA meeting. Somebody goes, I suffer from depression. I'd like to talk about the medications I'm taking. AA, that's what they mean, and we have no opinions on outside issues. That's for a therapist, that's for a counselor, that's for a doctor. And so that's what, on this talk, I would say the same kind of thing. If somebody's got trauma and they're dealing with that and they're in recovery, outside help is always, recommended. Because it's like when somebody breaks it, you don't take a broken arm to an AA meeting, they'll say. No, you go get a cast on that, go see a doctor.
I think, I'm a therapist, and I'm very, I think trauma-informed work, I'll just say, is very helpful.
Yeah. There's a thing we'll talk about in like dual diagnosis, where some people might have a mental condition that's different than alcoholism or substance abuse. And they'll usually in treatment centers say, try to treat both. So somebody, let's say, has depression and they're also alcoholic. Some people in the old days, it was like AA will take care of all your problems. I think there's enough humility to say, no, they won't. They'll take care of your alcoholism. They'll address your alcoholism. But also, if somebody has an outside issue, treating both, if it's a dual diagnosis, and I would say trauma probably fits in that same thing too, of getting help for both conditions.
All right. Well, thank you very much. That was really good for me to hear too. I like how you did the synthesis of the history. It's kind of fascinating, and then where we are today. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you for having me, and thank you, audience members, for chiming in.